The realtor's hands shook as she handed me the keys to 1247 Chestnut Street in Salem, Massachusetts. I should have paid attention to that tremor, should have asked why the Victorian house had been on the market for 3 years, despite being priced 30% below similar properties. Instead, I was too focused on my fresh start, too eager to put my failed marriage and painful divorce behind me, to notice the warning signs that screamed from every interaction surrounding this purchase. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a software engineer who thought logic and reason could protect me from anything life threw my way. I had always been skeptical of supernatural nonsense, viewing ghost stories and paranormal claims as entertainment for people who couldn't handle reality. That rational worldview served me well in my career, helping me debug complex systems and solve problems that stumped other developers. I believed that every mystery had a logical explanation, every strange occurrence could be traced back to natural causes, and every fear could be conquered through understanding and determination. I was completely, devastatingly wrong. The house itself was stunning. A 3-story Victorian built in 1847 that had somehow maintained most of its original architectural details, despite changing hands numerous times over the decades. The wraparound porch featured intricate woodwork that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when builders took pride in every decorative flourish. Inside, the hardwood floors gleamed beneath soaring ceilings adorned with crown molding that belonged in a museum. The kitchen had been updated just enough to be functional while preserving the home's historical character, and the master bedroom on the second floor offered views of Salem's tree-lined streets that looked particularly beautiful in the autumn light. What drew me most to the property was the basement, which the listing described as having been converted into a spacious home office and workshop area. As someone who worked from home, the idea of having a quiet, separate space for my computer setup and projects seemed perfect. The basement spanned the entire footprint of the house, with high ceilings and modern lighting that made it feel more like a finished lower level than a typical cellar. The previous owner had installed built-in desks along one wall and created what appeared to be a comfortable workspace that would allow me to be productive while maintaining clear boundaries between my living and working areas. The paperwork went through faster than any real estate transaction I had ever heard of, with the bank approving my mortgage application in record time and the title company rushing to schedule closing as if everyone involved wanted to finish the deal as quickly as possible. Even the home inspection seemed cursory, with the inspector spending less time in the basement than I expected and commenting that everything looked suitable for immediate occupancy without elaborating on any of the technical details I had prepared questions about. Looking back, I realize now that everyone connected to the sale was motivated by the same unspoken desire to transfer ownership of 1247 Chestnut Street to someone else as quickly as possible, though none of them were willing to explain why. Moving day arrived on a crisp October morning that filled me with optimism about my new beginning in Salem. The movers worked efficiently to transfer my belongings from the small apartment I had been renting since my divorce, and I spent the first few hours arranging furniture and unpacking boxes in a state of genuine excitement about finally having a real home again. The house felt welcoming during those initial hours, with afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows and highlighting the beautiful architectural details that had attracted me to the property in the first place. I set up my bedroom first, then moved on to organizing the kitchen, saving the basement office space for last, since that would require the most time to arrange according to my specific work requirements. As evening approached, I decided to tackle the basement setup so I could begin working from my new home office the following Monday. The basement looked exactly as it had during my previous visits, with the same modern lighting and finished appearance that had impressed me during the buying process. I spent about an hour arranging my computer equipment on the built-in desk, running cables for my monitors and setting up the ergonomic chair I had invested in for long coding sessions. The space felt productive and inspiring exactly as I had hoped it would, and I was congratulating myself on making such a smart purchase when I noticed something that hadn't registered during my earlier visits to the house. At the far end of the basement, partially hidden behind a support beam, there was a door I hadn't seen before. This wasn't unusual in itself, as old houses often contained storage areas and utility spaces that weren't immediately obvious during casual walkthroughs. What struck me as odd was that this door appeared to be made of much older wood than anything else in the renovated basement, with a dark stain and heavy iron hardware that looked original to the house's 1847 construction. The door also seemed somehow smaller than standard modern dimensions, as if it had been built for people of a different era, and it sat slightly below the level of the rest of the basement floor, accessible by 2 worn stone steps that I definitely hadn't noticed during any of my previous time in the space. Curiosity got the better of my exhaustion, and I approached the door to investigate what was obviously an original feature of the house that had been preserved during the basement renovation. The iron handle was cold to the touch and required more force than I expected to turn, as if the mechanism hadn't been used in years. When the latch finally released, the door opened with a deep creaking sound that seemed to echo through the basement despite the finished walls and drop ceiling that should have absorbed most audio reverberations. Beyond the doorway lay what appeared to be a small storage room carved directly from the bedrock beneath the house, with rough stone walls that gleamed slightly in the light from my basement office area. The storage space was deeper than I had anticipated, extending back into shadows that my overhead lighting couldn't fully penetrate. The air that drifted out of the room carried a scent I couldn't immediately identify, something earthy and organic that reminded me of compost or decay, but with an underlying metallic note that made me unconsciously step backward from the threshold. The temperature difference was immediately noticeable as well, with the air from the storage area feeling significantly colder than the climate-controlled basement I had just been working in. Most unsettling was the acoustic quality of the space, which seemed to swallow sound rather than echo it back, creating an oppressive silence that made me acutely aware of my own breathing and heartbeat. I decided to postpone exploring the storage area until I could return with a flashlight and proper lighting, but as I reached to pull the door closed, I heard something that made me freeze with my hand still on the iron handle. From somewhere deep within the stone room came a sound like rushing water, as if there was an underground stream flowing beneath the house that became audible only when the door was open. This seemed impossible given Salem's geography and the fact that no previous inspection or survey had mentioned any water features on the property, but the sound was undeniably real and seemed to grow slightly louder as I stood listening in the doorway. Accompanying the water sound was something else, a rhythmic noise that took me several seconds to identify as footsteps. Not the sharp clicking of shoes on stone, but the soft, wet sound of bare feet moving through shallow water, getting closer to where I stood with each step. Every rational part of my mind insisted that I was hearing pipes settling or some other mundane building noise, but my body responded with an immediate surge of adrenaline that left no doubt about the primitive danger my subconscious had detected in that approaching sound. I slammed the door shut with enough force to make the old iron hardware ring like a bell, and the sudden silence that followed felt more ominous than the mysterious sounds I had been hearing. That first night in my new house passed without any further incidents, though I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on all the doors and windows before bed, a habit I had never developed during years of living alone in my apartment. My sleep was restless and filled with dreams of dark water rising through stone corridors, but I attributed this to the stress of moving and the excitement of finally owning my own home. When I woke the next morning to brilliant sunshine streaming through my bedroom windows, the events in the basement felt distant and easily explained as the product of an overactive imagination combined with exhaustion from the moving process. I spent the weekend getting settled and exploring Salem's historic downtown area, visiting the famous sites associated with the witch trials and enjoying the autumn tourist season that brought the city to life every October. The house felt completely normal during daylight hours, with no strange sounds or unsettling atmospheres to remind me of my brief moment of unease in the basement storage room. I even went back down to my office area several times to continue setting up my workspace, though I noticed that I unconsciously avoided looking toward the far end of the basement where the old door stood closed behind its support beam. Monday morning brought my return to work routine, and I was pleased to discover that my new basement office provided an excellent environment for concentrating on complex programming tasks. The space was quiet, comfortable, and free from the distractions that had plagued me in my apartment setup. I spent the entire day productively working through a challenging database optimization project, taking breaks only to grab coffee and lunch from the kitchen upstairs. As afternoon moved toward evening, I felt genuinely satisfied with my decision to buy the house and confident that I had found the perfect work environment for my home-based career. It was during my final hour of work that day that I first noticed the sound of dripping water coming from somewhere in the basement. Initially, I assumed this was related to the house's plumbing system and made a mental note to investigate whether there might be a minor leak that needed attention. The dripping was slow and irregular, creating a rhythm that was just frequent enough to be noticeable, but not constant enough to identify the source through sound alone. I finished my workday and began shutting down my computer systems, planning to take a quick look around the basement to locate the source of the dripping before heading upstairs for dinner. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the old storage room, though it was difficult to pinpoint the exact location due to the acoustic properties of the finished basement. As I moved toward the far end of the space, I realized that the dripping sound was accompanied by something else, a subtle but unmistakable scent of fresh water that seemed out of place in the climate-controlled environment. When I reached the area near the old door, both the sound and the scent became noticeably stronger, suggesting that whatever was causing the dripping was indeed related to the storage space I had briefly explored on my first day in the house. I approached the door with considerably more caution than I had shown during my initial investigation, remembering the unsettling sounds I had heard when I first opened it. The iron handle was even colder than before, and I noticed that there were small droplets of water on the metal surface that couldn't be explained by condensation from the basement's humidity levels. When I turned the handle and cracked the door open just a few inches, the scent of water became overwhelming, carrying with it that same organic, decay-tinged odor that had made me uncomfortable during my first encounter with the storage space. Peering through the narrow gap, I could see that the stone floor of the storage room was covered with a thin layer of water that reflected the light from my basement office. The water appeared to be seeping up from between the stones rather than dripping from above, creating a slowly expanding pool that had not been present during my previous visit to the storage area. More disturbing was the realization that the water was not still, but moving in slow currents that suggested it was flowing toward some unseen destination deeper within the stone room. The movement was hypnotic and somehow wrong, as if the water was defying gravity or following patterns that made no physical sense. I closed the door immediately and spent the rest of the evening researching the geological and hydrological characteristics of Salem, trying to find some rational explanation for water appearing in what should have been a sealed storage area, carved from bedrock. Everything I read confirmed that the area where my house stood was not known for underground springs or water features that might account for the phenomenon I had witnessed. Property records and historical documents showed no mention of water issues in the basement of 1247 Chestnut Street, though I did discover that the house had changed owners with unusual frequency over its 175-year history, with most families living there for only a few years before selling and moving elsewhere. The next morning brought the first truly disturbing development, and what I was still trying to convince myself was a series of coincidental but explainable events. When I went down to my basement office to begin my workday, I found that the floor near the old door was wet, with a trail of water leading from the door area toward my desk setup. The water appeared to be the same clear liquid I had seen pooling in the storage room, but its presence outside the sealed space was impossible to explain through any natural process I could imagine. More unsettling was the pattern the water had formed as it spread across the basement floor, creating shapes that looked almost like letters or symbols, though I couldn't decipher any meaning from the random-seeming configurations. I spent my lunch break mopping up the water and checking for any obvious leaks in the basement's plumbing or HVAC systems, but found no source that could account for the mysterious liquid. The old door remained firmly closed, with no visible gaps around its frame that would allow water to escape from the storage room beyond. Yet when I cautiously opened the door to check the interior space, I found that the water level inside had risen significantly overnight, now covering the stone floor to a depth of several inches and creating an underground pool that extended back into the shadows beyond my ability to see clearly. The sound of moving water was much more pronounced now. No longer the subtle whisper I had initially detected, but a distinct current that suggested the presence of a substantial underground stream flowing through or beneath the storage area. Most disturbing was the realization that the water was not stagnant, but actively flowing in patterns that seemed to respond to my presence, creating ripples and currents that moved toward the doorway whenever I stood in the opening. The organic scent was stronger as well, now carrying undertones that reminded me of something decomposing in stagnant water, though the liquid itself appeared clean and clear. That night, I was awakened by sounds coming from the basement that I initially mistook for the house's heating system cycling on. As I lay in bed listening, however, I realized that the sounds were more complex and rhythmic than any mechanical system would produce. There was definitely the sound of moving water, but it was accompanied by other noises that I couldn't immediately identify. Wet slapping sounds that seemed to occur in regular intervals, as if something was moving through the water in the storage room with deliberate, measured steps. I convinced myself that I was hearing the normal settling sounds of an old house, combined with the unusual water situation in the basement, but sleep eluded me for the rest of the night as the sounds continued at irregular intervals until dawn. When I finally went downstairs to investigate in the morning light, I found that the water trail from the storage room door had expanded considerably, now covering much of the basement floor with a thin layer of liquid that made walking treacherous and had begun to damage some of the boxes I had stored near the walls. More disturbing than the expanded water damage was the discovery of what appeared to be footprints in the wet areas of the basement floor. The prints were human in basic shape, but larger than seemed possible, with elongated toes and no visible heel marks, as if whatever had made them moved by gliding rather than walking in any normal sense. The prints formed a trail that led from the storage room door to various locations throughout the basement, including areas directly beneath my office desk where I spent my working hours each day. Some of the prints appeared fresh, with clearly defined edges that suggested they had been made within the past few hours. I called a plumber that morning, desperate for any practical explanation for the water intrusion that was rapidly making my basement office unusable. The plumber, a local contractor who had been servicing Salem homes for over 20 years, spent several hours examining the basement's plumbing systems and checking for possible sources of the leak. His confusion was evident as he worked, particularly when he examined the old storage room and found no broken pipes or obvious water sources that could account for the flooding. What unsettled me most was his reaction to the storage space itself, the way he quickly backed out of the doorway after taking only a brief look inside, muttering something about not being paid enough for this kind of work. When I pressed him for an explanation of what he meant, the plumber became evasive and focused on completing his inspection as quickly as possible. His final assessment was that there were no plumbing-related issues in the basement that could explain the water intrusion, and he suggested that I contact a foundation specialist to check for possible groundwater seepage through the stone walls. What he didn't explain was why he packed up his tools so hastily, or why he refused to accept payment for his time, insisting that he hadn't actually fixed anything, and recommending that I consider whether this is really the right house for someone in my situation. That afternoon, I decided to document the strange occurrences by taking photographs of the flooded storage room and the mysterious footprints that continued to appear in the basement despite my efforts to dry the area. When I reviewed the images on my camera's LCD screen, I discovered that the photographs showed details that I hadn't noticed with my naked eyes. The water in the storage room appeared to contain shapes that moved beneath the surface, dark forms that seemed too large and complex to be simple debris or reflections. More disturbing were the footprints, which appeared in the photographs to be accompanied by drag marks, as if whatever was making the prints was also pulling something heavy behind it as it moved through the basement. The photographs also revealed that the stone walls of the storage room were covered with markings that I hadn't seen during my direct visual examinations of the space. The markings appeared to be carved directly into the rock, forming patterns and symbols that looked like no alphabet or writing system I had ever encountered. Some of the carvings seemed to depict human figures, but with proportions and features that were distorted in ways that made them deeply unsettling to look at, even in the small camera display. Other markings resembled architectural drawings or maps, showing what might have been rooms or passages extending far beyond the visible boundaries of the storage area. That evening, I made the decision to contact the previous owner of the house, using contact information I had found in the closing documents from my purchase. The phone number connected me to a woman named Margaret Henley, who had lived at 1247 Chestnut Street for only 18 months before putting the property on the market and moving out of state. Margaret's reaction to my call was immediate and intense, with a sharp intake of breath when I identified myself as the new owner and mentioned that I was experiencing some unusual issues with the basement area. Margaret's account of her own experiences in the house confirmed my worst fears about what I was dealing with. She described the same progression of events that I had been experiencing, beginning with the discovery of the storage room and escalating through water intrusion, strange sounds, and the appearance of those impossibly large footprints throughout the basement. According to Margaret, the situation had continued to worsen during her time in the house, with the entity or entities responsible for the disturbances becoming increasingly bold in their activities and eventually making their presence known throughout the entire house rather than confining themselves to the basement area. Margaret's description of her final weeks in the house were terrifying to hear and impossible to dismiss as imagination or psychological distress. She described being awakened nightly by the sounds of movement throughout the house, with wet footprints appearing in hallways and bedrooms despite her efforts to seal off the basement completely. She spoke of seeing shapes moving through the rooms at night, figures that seemed to be composed of water and shadow, but retained enough human characteristics to be recognizable as something that had once been alive. Most disturbing was her account of the dreams that began during her final month in the house, vivid nightmares in which she found herself drawn back to the storage room and compelled to descend into water-filled passages that extended far beneath Salem, where ancient things waited in the darkness for living people to join them in their endless existence. Margaret's final advice to me was unequivocal and urgent. Leave the house immediately without trying to understand or resolve whatever was happening in the basement. She explained that her own attempts to investigate the phenomenon had only made the situation worse, drawing more attention from the entities that dwelled in the underground spaces and encouraging them to expand their activities beyond the confines of the storage room. According to Margaret, the house at 1247 Chestnut Street was connected to something far older and more dangerous than any normal haunting, something that had been claiming residents of Salem for generations through a network of underground passages that connected to similar storage rooms and other historic properties throughout the city. Despite Margaret's warnings, I couldn't bring myself to abandon the house that represented my fresh start and financial security after the devastating costs of my divorce. Instead, I decided to research the property's history more thoroughly, hoping to find some historical context that would help me understand and possibly resolve the situation without having to flee from what I had believed would be my permanent home. My research into the Salem City records and historical archives revealed a disturbing pattern of unexplained disappearances and deaths associated with properties in my neighborhood, dating back to the original settlement of the area in the mid-1600s. The house at 1247 Chestnut Street had been built on land that was originally part of a larger estate owned by Ezekiel Whitmore, a merchant who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1692 during the height of the witch trial hysteria. According to surviving documents, Whitmore had been excavating beneath his property to create cold storage areas for his import business when he broke through into what he described in his journal as chambers of great antiquity that were carved by no Christian hand. Whitmore's final journal entries spoke of finding carved symbols and evidence of previous human habitation in the underground spaces, along with pools of water that seemed to flow upward from impossible depths and reflected images that bore no resemblance to the viewer looking into them. Whitmore's disappearance had been followed by similar vanishings of subsequent property owners and their families throughout the following centuries, with records showing that 1247 Chestnut Street and several neighboring houses had been the sites of unexplained disappearances roughly every 20 to 30 years. The pattern was subtle enough that it had never attracted official attention, particularly given Salem's reputation for supernatural folklore that made authorities dismissive of reports involving paranormal phenomena. However, when viewed collectively, the records painted a clear picture of something predatory and patient that used the underground spaces beneath the neighborhood to claim victims on a regular basis. Most disturbing were the few surviving first-hand accounts from people who had encountered the underground entities and lived to describe their experiences. These testimonies, found in private letters and diary entries held by the Salem Historical Society, described creatures that appeared to be human, but moved and behaved in ways that violated natural law. The entities were consistently described as being composed partly of water, able to flow through spaces too small for normal human passage, while retaining enough solid form to manipulate objects and leave physical traces of their presence. Several accounts mentioned the creature's apparent ability to mimic human voices and appearances, though they seemed unable to maintain these disguises for extended periods without revealing their true nature. Armed with this historical context, I began to understand that my situation was far more dangerous than I had initially realized. The entities dwelling beneath 1247 Chestnut Street were not ghosts or supernatural phenomena in any traditional sense, but something far older and more alien to human experience. They appeared to be predators that had established themselves in the underground spaces beneath Salem long before European settlement, adapting their hunting methods over the centuries to take advantage of human habitation patterns while remaining hidden from authorities who might pose a threat to their continued existence. The realization that I was dealing with intelligent, predatory entities rather than random supernatural phenomena forced me to completely reconsider my approach to the situation. These creatures had been successfully claiming victims for hundreds of years by drawing them into the underground spaces where they held every advantage. My attempts to investigate and understand the situation were exactly what they wanted, each visit to the storage room providing them with more opportunities to study my behavior and plan their approach. The expanding water intrusion and increasing boldness of their activities suggested that they were preparing for something more direct than the subtle stalking behavior Margaret had described during her final weeks in the house. That night, I was awakened by the sound of my basement door opening and closing, followed by footsteps on the wooden stairs that led down to my office area. The footsteps were unmistakably human in rhythm, but wrong in other ways that I couldn't immediately identify, perhaps too heavy or too evenly spaced to belong to any normal person. I lay in bed listening as the footsteps moved through the basement, accompanied by the now familiar sound of dripping water and the wet slapping noise I had been hearing during the night hours. Most terrifying was the realization that the footsteps seemed to be exploring the basement in a methodical way, moving from area to area as if someone was conducting a thorough search of the space. I forced myself to get up and investigate, knowing that ignoring the situation would only allow it to escalate further. When I reached the top of the basement stairs and looked down into the darkness below, I could see light reflecting off water that now covered the entire basement floor to a depth of several inches. The light was coming from the storage room, which was standing wide open despite my certainty that I had closed and latched it before going to bed. More disturbing was the fact that the light appeared to be emanating from within the storage room itself, casting wavering reflections on the water that moved in patterns too regular to be random. As I stood at the top of the stairs, I heard a voice calling my name from somewhere in the flooded basement. The voice was recognizably human and female, speaking in tones that seemed familiar, though I couldn't immediately identify the speaker. The voice called again, more insistently, and I realized with growing horror that it sounded like my own voice, as if one of the creatures was attempting to mimic my speech patterns in order to draw me down into the basement. The imitation was not perfect, carrying subtle distortions that made it sound like my voice played back through water or spoken by someone whose mouth was not shaped for human speech. The voice continued calling my name while I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, unable to decide whether to flee the house entirely or confront whatever was waiting in the basement. The decision was made for me when I heard additional voices joining the first, creating a chorus of imperfect imitations of my own speech that seemed to be coming from multiple locations throughout the flooded basement. Some of the voices seemed to be calling from the storage room itself, while others appeared to originate from areas near my desk and workspace, as if multiple entities had positioned themselves around the basement to prevent any escape through alternative routes. I retreated to my bedroom and barricaded the door, spending the rest of the night listening to the sounds of movement throughout the house as the entities explored areas far beyond the basement. I could hear wet footprints in the hallways, the sound of doors opening and closing, and occasionally the scratch of something hard being dragged across the wooden floors. Most disturbing were the voices, which continued throughout the night, but gradually became more accurate in their imitation of my speech patterns, suggesting that the creatures were learning from their attempts and becoming more skilled at mimicking human communication. By morning, the sounds had stopped, and the house felt normal again, though I found evidence of the night's activities in the form of water damage throughout the first floor and wet footprints that led from the basement stairs to every room in the house. The footprints were larger and more defined than any I'd seen previously, with clear impressions that showed not just toes and the general outline of feet, but details like what appeared to be gills or slits along the sides of each toe. The prints also showed evidence of webbing between the digits, confirming that whatever was making them was adapted for aquatic existence rather than terrestrial movement. I spent that day making preparations to leave the house, packing essential belongings and researching temporary accommodation options, while trying to decide whether to put the property back on the market or simply abandon it entirely. My research into similar situations suggested that attempting to sell a property with active supernatural phenomena would be difficult and potentially dangerous, as the entities seemed to target anyone who spent extended time in the house, regardless of whether they were owners or simply visitors. The pattern of previous owners' experiences suggested that the creatures were patient and persistent, continuing their stalking behavior until they successfully claimed their intended victims. As evening approached, I made the decision to spend one final night in the house while completing my packing, planning to leave early the following morning and never return to 1247 Chestnut Street. This decision proved to be a nearly fatal mistake, as the entities seemed to recognize that their opportunity to claim me was rapidly disappearing and responded by abandoning the subtle stalking behavior they had employed throughout my residence in favor of a direct assault that nearly cost me my life and sanity. The attack began shortly after sunset, with the familiar sounds of rising water in the basement, quickly followed by the more ominous noise of multiple entities moving through the house simultaneously. Unlike previous nights, when the creatures had seemed content to explore and observe, this time they moved with obvious purpose toward my location on the second floor. I could hear them ascending the stairs, their wet footsteps accompanied by a sliding, flowing sound that suggested they were partially liquefying themselves to move more quickly through the house. When the first entity reached the second floor, I caught my initial clear glimpse of what I had been sharing the house with for the past weeks. The creature appeared human from a distance, but closer examination revealed features that were fundamentally wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. Its proportions were subtly distorted, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in directions that human anatomy didn't allow. Most disturbing was its face, which seemed to shift between different appearances as if it couldn't maintain a consistent form, sometimes resembling me, sometimes taking on features that might have belonged to previous victims of the entity's predation. The creature's skin had a translucent quality that allowed me to see dark fluid flowing beneath the surface in patterns that resembled a circulatory system, but moved too quickly and in directions that defied biological logic. When it spoke, using a perfect imitation of my own voice, I could see that its mouth contained rows of needle-sharp teeth behind what appeared to be normal human lips and gums. Most terrifying was the realization that this entity was not acting alone, as I could hear similar creatures moving through other parts of the house, coordinating their approach with the precision of pack hunters who had perfected their techniques over centuries of successful predation. I barricaded myself in the master bedroom, using furniture to block the door, while the entities tested the barriers and called to me in voices that cycled through perfect imitations of my own speech, my ex-husband's voice, my parents', and other people who had been important in my life. The creatures seemed to have access to my memories and experiences, using personal information and intimate details to try to convince me to open the door and join them willingly. Their psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as their physical abilities, demonstrating intelligence and planning capacity that made them far more dangerous than any mindless supernatural threat. The siege of my bedroom continued throughout the night, with the entities taking turns attempting different approaches to break through my defenses. Some tried physical force, throwing themselves against the door with impacts that shook the entire room and gradually weakened the furniture I had stacked against the entrance. Others attempted psychological warfare, using the voices of people I loved to beg for help or claiming that they were trapped somewhere in the house and needed me to rescue them. The most disturbing approach involved the creatures somehow projecting images directly into my mind, showing me visions of the underground spaces beneath Salem, where previous victims existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor completely dead, serving as food sources and breeding hosts for the ancient entities that had claimed them. As dawn approached, the attacks became more desperate and violent, with multiple entities working together to break through my barricades, while others seemed to be attempting to enter the bedroom through alternative routes. I could hear them in the walls, moving through spaces that should have been too small to accommodate anything larger than insects, their liquid nature allowing them to flow through the house's infrastructure in ways that bypassed normal security measures. The sounds they made while moving through the walls were indescribable, wet slithering noises punctuated by the scraping of claws or teeth against wood and metal. When the first rays of sunlight entered the bedroom window, the attack stopped abruptly, replaced by a retreat that was as coordinated as the assault had been. I could hear the entities flowing back toward the basement, their movements accompanied by sounds that suggested disappointment or frustration at their failure to claim me during the night. The sudden silence that followed their withdrawal was almost as terrifying as the attack itself, carrying the unmistakable promise that this had been only a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent victory. I escaped from 1247 Chestnut Street that morning, taking only what I could carry and leaving behind most of my possessions rather than risk spending additional time in the house while the entities regrouped for another assault. My flight from Salem was motivated by the understanding that the creatures were not confined to the house itself, but used an extensive network of underground passages that could potentially allow them to track and follow me if I remained in the area. The historical records I had researched suggested that their territory encompassed much of the older part of Salem, making any local accommodation potentially dangerous for someone they had already identified as a target. The months since my escape have been marked by ongoing psychological trauma and the constant fear that the entities from 1247 Chestnut Street might eventually locate and resume their pursuit of me. I've moved 3 times since leaving Salem, each time to locations that are geographically and culturally as far from Massachusetts as possible, but I continue to experience symptoms that suggest the creature's influence may extend beyond the physical boundaries of their underground territory. My dreams are filled with images of water-filled passages and the sounds of approaching footsteps, while my waking hours are haunted by the paranoid certainty that I'm being watched and followed by intelligences that view me as unfinished business. More disturbing are the reports I've received from other people who have had contact with properties in Salem's historic district, suggesting that the entities dwelling beneath 1247 Chestnut Street are part of a larger network of predatory intelligences that have been systematically claiming victims throughout New England for centuries. The pattern of their activities suggests a level of organization and long-term planning that indicates they are far more than simple monsters, but represent an entire civilization of aquatic beings that has adapted to coexist with human populations while remaining hidden from scientific discovery and official recognition. My attempts to warn authorities about the situation have been met with the skepticism and dismissal I expected, though I have made contact with a small network of people who have survived similar encounters with what appear to be related entities in other historical locations along the East Coast. Their accounts confirm that the creatures I encountered represent part of a much larger phenomenon that has been claiming victims for generations, while successfully avoiding detection by remaining patient, selective, and careful to target individuals who are unlikely to be believed if they survive to report their experiences. The house at 1247 Chestnut Street remains on the market, with a new real estate agency handling the listing after the previous company withdrew their services following difficulties with the property inspection process. The price has been reduced significantly, and the listing now includes language about the property being suitable for buyers interested in renovation projects and perfect for someone looking for a unique historical property with character. I monitor the listing periodically, knowing that eventually someone else will purchase the house and begin the same progression of experiences that I survived, drawn by the same combination of historical charm and impossible affordability that made the property attractive to me. The entities that dwell beneath Salem continue their ancient hunting patterns, patient and intelligent predators who have perfected their techniques over centuries of successful predation. They remain active, dangerous, and completely beyond human ability to understand or defeat, representing a form of evil that is far older and more sophisticated than anything our species has developed the capacity to recognize or combat. The underground spaces they inhabit extend far beyond any single property, connecting historic locations throughout New England in a network that allows them to coordinate their activities and share information about potential victims across vast geographical areas. If this supernatural horror story gave you chills, please hit the like button and let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced anything similar in a historic property. Your support helps me continue sharing these terrifying true accounts that most people are afraid to discuss publicly. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss these real paranormal experiences that prove some evil forces are beyond human understanding or control. Share this story with anyone who thinks they're brave enough to handle the truth about what really lurks beneath America's oldest cities. Have you ever lived in a house with unexplained water problems or strange basement areas? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. And remember that sometimes the best real estate deals come with prices that can't be measured in money.